Why Russians don't speak English or any other foreign language. If you have ever seen Russians abroad or happened to visit Russia, you would know that most Russians don't speak English. Why is that? Nowadays people in many countries all over the world speak English as international language, but not Russians. If they need to ask or explain something to a foreigner, they just start speaking slower and louder, still in Russian. So why Russians don't know English? Reason number one, they just don't need it. Most Russians have never been abroad and many of them have never met a foreigner. There are not many chances to meet a foreigner in Russia unless you live in Moscow or St. Petersburg. So it's a pretty rare situation for an average Russian to communicate with a person from other country. And if Russians go abroad, many of them just buy vacation tours to countries like Turkey or Egypt where they eat, drink and lie on the beach in all-inclusive hotels. If they go sightseeing, they have a Russian-speaking guide and staff in that hotel speak some Russian just because they have so many visitors from Russia. So this situation made Russians think that service staff all around the globe has to know Russian, and they get frustrated when it's not like that. Reason number two, historical background doesn't help. Couple centuries ago, when Russian society was divided to noblemen and peasants, it was common for nobility to speak several languages fluently. They had good education, foreign tutors, used to live in Europe for a long time. There was a period in history when French was home language for aristocratic families in Russia. And of course, peasants didn't know any foreign languages. Everything changed after 1917 when revolution happened in Russia, last Russian king was murdered, and communists started to rule the country. Basically, it was war between rich and poor people won, so many noble families escaped the country. That's how not too many people left in Russia who could speak several languages. New government had serious problems to deal with, like civil war and hunger, and speaking of education, it was more important to teach majority of people, I mean those peasants, to read and write than to speak English or German or whatever. Later in Soviet history, Russians had Iron Curtain that made going abroad impossible for most Russians, as it did pretty difficult for foreigners to visit Russia. In Soviet Union, knowledge of a foreign language and talking to a foreigner, if you can find any, was kinda dangerous because Russian government was so suspicious about spies. So that's why previous generations of Russians didn't know English.
Let me speak from my heart in English.
Reason number three, teaching English in Russia sucks. Actually, people in Russia study foreign languages several years at school. That's a lot of time, but it doesn't make any difference. Average Russian leaves school with knowledge of just several words and phrases in English, and that's it. Maybe the reason is bad educational program. Often students just do some exercises from books, which is pretty boring. Maybe reason is a teacher who also has never been abroad and learned language by books, not by real life experience. Maybe the reason is lack of motivation. They studied something they were not going to use. Maybe the reason is lack of practice. Without regular practice, you forget language quite easily, even if you know something. So that's why Russians don't speak English. Fortunately, nowadays situation is changing. A new generation of Russians shows better results in learning foreign languages. Now we have internet, Russians go abroad, you can get movies and videos in English easily. Some are even lucky to have native speakers as teachers. And the most important thing is that young people in Russia have much stronger connections with outer world than their parents and great-parents did. So hopefully soon there will be more Russians able to speak English. But not now.